So today I am going to be doing one of the two expansion team in the moving forward series, and that of course is Inter Miami. Now, this is going to be a tricky moving forward series to talk about because normally when an expansion team is able to make it to the playoffs in their very first season, that is always going to consider a success because after all, there was not a lot of expansion team that is able to make it to the playoffs in their very first season, and Inter Miami basically joined a very small elusive list of 7 teams to make it to the playoffs in their first ever season in MLS. But that being said, I can understand why there's a lot of people that is putting a big asterisk next to their name in terms of this elusive club, and the fact that some people will even say that this turns out to be a very disappointing season for Inter Miami. And after all that hype that was surrounded in this team and all that hype that they were going to bring in some big name European superstar player because of the David Beckham connection, and eventually they did kind of bring in some big name European player like with the like of Blaise Matuidi and Gonzalo Higuain. It was not as big as what we thought, that they were pretty much at one point linked with almost everybody and even some of the world's best players like Messi, Suarez, and Ronaldo to potentially come into this team. And that, unsurprisingly, when they tried to bring those big name European superstar player to come into this team, they turns out to be a huge flop, and it did not contribute to success. And it also kind of just continued to prove my point that the league is definitely evolved in a situation where you just simply cannot go to bring these aging European superstar player to come to the league and expect that they're going to carry you to have success in the league. I mean, they can potentially maybe guide you to the playoff once in a while, but if you're expected to make an MLS Cup run, that is definitely not the formula to try to do. Now, another formula that Inter Miami tried to do in terms of their expansion season was that they tried to copy the Atlanta United model by going down to South America, find these hidden gems to bring them back to the team to develop them, and they did get a couple of those South American players, but most of them turns out to be a huge flop in that instead of hitting diamonds in the rough patch, they basically just hit rock in terms of that rough patch of all those young South American players that they brought in, and it turns out most of them was a huge flop to this team. But that being said, in terms of their overall season, they finished with a record of 7 wins, 3 draws, and 13 losses, and only finished with 24 points, which I think that is by far the lowest amount of points that any playoff team is able to make, and hence that's another evidence of why people are saying that they should have an asterisk next to their name in terms of being an expansion team to make it to the playoffs, because no expansion team has made it to the playoffs with that low amount of point. And that if you even look at the points per game ratio, they actually have one of the worst points per game ratio compared to previous expansion team in the past 10 years. And I believe only FC Cincinnati has a worse points per game ratio than what Inter Miami did heading into their inaugural season. But because of the fact that they were definitely the biggest benefactor of the expanded playoff in the Eastern Conference, and the fact that since there was just so many bad teams in the Eastern Conference, and that you really have to suck very hard to not make it to the playoffs in the Eastern Conference, they just did enough in terms of squeaking into that last spot in the playoffs in the Eastern Conference. But that being said, they only scored 25 goals this season, which was by far one of the lowest amount of goals, not just in the Eastern Conference, but in the entire league. They gave up 35 goals this season with a goal differential of -10. Again, they finished 10th in the Eastern Conference, but ultimately was eliminated by Nashville in the play-in rounds. And even before, I know a couple of days when their chances of beating Nashville was pretty much almost at zero, with them getting a COVID outbreak, and that when they basically announced that they were going to missing pretty much half of their team against Nashville, it was pretty clear that they had no chance of winning that game. But even then, I still thought that besides the COVID outbreak that we found out later, I didn't think they had a lot of shot against Nashville too, mainly because Nashville was a team that was coming into the playoffs red hot compared to an Inter Miami team that was very inconsistent heading into the playoffs. I just feel like that Nashville probably are in a better shape in terms of able to move on as an expansion team compared to what Inter Miami is going to do. And that, again, the fate of of Inter Miami potentially going to get eliminated really kind of came when they found out that they were going to miss half of their squad, because half of their squad unfortunately got tested positive for COVID-19. Now, for the MVP of this team, it's got to be Lewis Morgan. I mean, if there isn't really a lot of players on that team that really live up to the expectation, and that a lot of players on this team underachieve with the talent that they were supposed to bring in this team. But if there's one player that definitely did not underachieve and at least live up to an expectation, has to be Lewis Morgan. I mean, he was the top goal scorer and the top assist leader for this team, and really the only guy that has been consistently good in terms of the attack for this Inter Miami team. And that, again, there's just no surprise that I decided to put him as the best player on this team. Now, for the disappointment part, this is where it's going to get tough to choose, and it's not for a good reason, because there's just so many players that I could name that is the most disappointing player for this team. In fact, I could pretty much name almost everybody on the most disappointing player on here, or I could basically name them the most disappointing player on this team, because again, most of them pretty much underachieved and came nowhere near in terms of the way that Inter Miami thought that they were going to be with their team. But I am actually going to go with two players, and I know some people will say that I'll probably go with Gonzalo Higuain or even Blaise Matuidi, because, you know, Higuain is a very easy target with the way that, despite the fact that they pay $7 million for him, and that they finally got that big name European superstar player that they were going to get this season, and really kind of the missing puzzle in terms of how to get this team going on the attack, and finally found that number 9. He only scored one goal this season, and it turns out that one goal was that amazing free kick against the Red Bulls. But other than that, there was really no highlight whatsoever, and most of the time that he's been with Inter Miami has been just filled with lowlights. And the same can be said about Blaise Matuidi, with the way that this was a guy that was a regular starter for Juventus, and also a World Cup winner with the French national team. And as soon as he come to MLS and joined Inter Miami, he looked nothing like that kind of player when he was with Juventus and with the French national team, and looked more like the player that was on the wrong end of the 30s, and really kind of in that period where maybe he might even think about potentially hang up his boots with the way how bad he played during his first season with Inter Miami. But I'm not going to pick both of those players because those are kind of easy target to pick, and that I'm actually instead going to go with the first two signing of Inter Miami in Julian Carranza and Matheus Pellegrini over those two guys. And I think the only reason I will pick Carranza and Pellegrini over Higuain and Matuidi is that at least when Higuain and Matuidi was in this team, they basically were kind of a huge flop during half of the season, as they were mid-season picked up. But for Carranza and Pellegrini, I would consider they were the full season flop for Inter Miami, and that these are two guys that they literally spent $15 million combined to able to get both of them, including spending a lot of money to get Pellegrini as a DP kind of player. And not only the fact that both of them only contribute 3 goals and 4 assists throughout the time, but both of these players has not at times spent been more on the bench than them actually being on the pitch. And for Julian Carranza, that is definitely the case for him, where he basically, even though I know he suffered a knee injury earlier the season, when he came back to this team in the second phase, or actually not the second phase, but the first phase of the regular season after the MLS is back tournament, he basically lost his spot, and the 2 goals that he scored was really in that historic win against Orlando City that gave Inter Miami their first ever win in MLS. But after that, he was pretty much invincible, and he couldn't even get into this team for most of the time. And Pellegrini, again, a DP kind of player that, even though he registered 4 assists to this team, and it's 3rd on the list in terms of the top assist leader, you got to think that that number is clearly below what you would expect a number 10 DP kind of player that Inter Miami thought Pellegrini was. And that there's also kind of at times that I remember where Pellegrini was just so bad for this team, and he was in such a bad run of form that he was actually being benched because of that. And when you decided to bench your designated player, or have one of your designated player not getting regular minutes, that pretty much is a telling sign that you're probably not going to do very well in the league. And it's no surprise that Inter Miami really struggle throughout this season. So yeah, I have to go with Carenza and Pellegrini as really considered the most disappointing player, and arguably the biggest flop of these two players coming to this team. Now, in terms of the top goals score chart, you got Lewis Morgan, as I said, leads the team with 5 goals. And again, this was a team that is one of those teams that struggle in terms of scoring goals, which is no surprise that their top goal scorer only able to register five goals and came nowhere near the double-digit mark. But then in second place, and I kid you not, Brek Shea actually finished second with 4 goals this season. And 2020 is crazy when Brek Shea is actually on this top goal scorer list, and he ends up to be second in the team in terms of top goal scorer mark. And this is no disrespect to Brek Shea, but if you have Brek Shea as one of your player as being a top goal scorer and want your more lethal attack, then yeah, something is clearly wrong with your team, and that your attack probably is going to really struggle. And again, it's no surprise that is also an evidence of another piece of why Inter Miami really struggle throughout this season. Then you got Rodolfo Pizarro in third place with 4 goals, Juan Agudelo with 3 goals, and finish off with LGP with 2 goals in 5th place in terms of the top goal scorer leader chart. Top assist leader chart, again, you got Lewis Morgan with 8 assists, followed by Pizarro with 5 assists, Mateus Pellegrini with 4 assists, Victor Oyola with 3 assists, and Gonzalo Higuain rounds off that list with 2 assists to his name. So what went right for Inter Miami? Well, there wasn't a lot of things that went right with this team, but hey, at least they made it to the playoffs. And that, even though if people are going to put an asterisk next to their name in terms of them making the playoffs this season, down the road, if we go back looking at the history book of this season, they will always be in the name of being a team that make it to the playoffs, and will always remember as one of the few teams that actually make it to the playoffs in their expansion year. They did well against their rivals. They were able to win half of the game against Orlando City, and also did well against Atlanta United. And I'm not quite sure if you, as any Inter Miami fans, Atlanta is considered their big rival, but hey, they at least did well against them. And if you want to even include Nashville, they sort of did well against them, and sort of didn't do well because of the fact that they got eliminated by Nashville in the playing round. But the third thing that went right for them is that at least the defense was decent for the first half of the season. And I really think if there was positive coming out of that 5-game losing run to start their life in MLS, it has to be the defense. And that they were kind of very unlucky with the way that when you look at most of their game, they were in the game for the majority part of it, but unfortunately they just lacked that big moment that could potentially get them either a point or even get all 3 points in a game. And that, unfortunately, that was kind of one of the reasons why they would start the season with 5 straight losses to start their life in MLS. But the defense was not the issue. The defense was just rock solid for the first half of the season. But now let's go to what went wrong with this team. And speaking of the 5 straight losses to start their life in MLS, that's one of them. I mean, they really dug themselves in a huge hole to start the season. And in some way, I would also say that maybe that could be what went right with them too, because as much as it might be negative to say that they dug themselves in a huge hole to start their life in MLS, they still made it to the playoffs at the end of the season, and I think they're the only team in league history to able to start the season with 5 straight losses and still end up making the playoffs at the end of the season. And I know that's not really a record that Inter Miami want to get, but hey, I mean, that's pretty impressive with the way that how bad this team went, and that this was kind of the worst team in the league coming out of the MLS's back tournament, and yet somehow in some way they still able to make it to the playoffs. The attack, as I said, it was really lifeless throughout most of the season. I mean, for majority of the season, they just cannot score goals, and I think they only scored like 3 goals on 2 occasions for the entire season. And then the defense, which I talked about how it was impressive in the first half of the season. The second half of the season was a different story. The defense really fell apart in the second half of the season, and crack really showed in that game against the Red Bulls, where they suffered their very first blowout of their MLS inaugural season by losing 4-1 at home. And that was really a game where after that I believe they lost 3-0 to the Union, and then their defense just never looked the same and looked as solid as what we saw in the first half of the season, and it almost cost them to potentially not make the playoffs heading into their inaugural year. Now, moving forward for Inter Miami, first thing for them to do in terms of this offseason is that they probably need a new sporting director after Paul McDonough a couple of weeks ago announced that he's not going to be returning with this team, and that they maybe need to find a new head coach too, because there was speculation that Diego Alonso was not returning this team was not returning this team for a second season, and that there was even some rumors saying that Inter Miami actually fired Diego Alonso and that they were looking for a new head coach. And then there also are speculation of the fact that he was going to be going to Uruguay to coach Pinero and becoming a new head coach of that team. So far, those speculation hasn't come true whatsoever, but in case if it does come true, then yeah, they definitely need to find a head coach heading into this off season, and need a brand new head coach heading into their second season in their franchise history. Now, the second thing that they need to do moving forward, and this is probably the most important thing that they need to figure out heading into this off season, and really maybe could determine how are they going to do in their second season, is that they need an identity. They absolutely need an identity and structure in this team, and that if Diego Alonso is going to be coming back as the head coach of this team, he needs to figure out what kind of tactics and what formation he's going to use with this team, because throughout the first season he basically used every single formation that you could use in pretty much every single game. And when you decided to use that many formation and just experiment with players playing either out of position or playing in a different position, it's no wonder why this team was very inconsistent for the entire part of the second half of the season, and that they started life in MLS with 5 straight losses. Because when you just have no structure and no identity whatsoever, and just no tactical point to figure out how to get the best out of your player, that's when you know the fact that the team is in a sunken ship, and that for Diego Alonso, if he is going to get this team back into the playoffs and even improve after a really mediocre first season in the league, he needs to find the right tactics and really just need to find an identity and structure to implement it to this team. And this identity and structure might not work at first, but I think he needs to eventually find one and just kind of stick with it, and not just change it pretty much every single game, because we've seen before where when a team does not have a structure and an identity, usually those are the team that does not make it to the playoffs and are considered one of the worst team in the league. And then the last thing that they need to do moving forward is that they have to be smart in terms of the signings in the offseason. Now, I have no doubt that they're going to be once again linked with some of the biggest name in soccer because of the Beckham connection, and that there's always going to be that memes about how they've been linked with everybody, and yet they have not signed anybody at the end of the day. But that being said, I still think that they eventually are going to sign somebody. But if they're going to sign a big name European superstar player, first of all, you got to make sure it's a big name kind of player like Suarez or even Messi or some player kind of quality like that. Because if you're going to sign a big name European superstar player, that might be a good name, but he might not fit into your system or actually do well coming into the league, it is not going to work whatsoever. And that in some way, if they're going to sign kind of like a Gonzalo Higuain level kind of a big name player, yeah, that is not going to work whatsoever. And that also, if they're going to once again head back down to South America, they need to also do better in terms of scouting these players, and that they got to make sure that the players that they bring are actually generally going to do well with this team, because as what we saw in the first season, when they try to go down to South America, find these hidden gems, it just turns out to be a rough patch instead of actually gems that they of course found. So yeah, they need to be much smarter in terms of their signing heading into this off season, and they might not even think about maybe be a squad overhaul heading into this off season, because again, since there was a lot of players that was underachieving this year, and that knowing the fact that they had one of the worst expansion seasons besides FC Cincinnati in recent memory, usually when you have that bad of the season, you got to go to a bit of a squad overhaul, or even think about changing things up. And I think that might be another thing that Inter Miami might be thinking about heading into this offseason if they're going to improve heading into the second year. But yeah, there you have it. That is pretty much it for this moving forward series about Inter Miami. Let me know in the comments below, what do you think of this video? If you're an Inter Miami fan, what do you think went right, what went wrong, and most importantly, moving forward, how your team is going to look heading into their second season. But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you do, make sure you guys leave a like, smash the subscribe button, and yeah, I of course will see you guys next time.